in Matthew chapter 2, and we're about to read of a king, these Magi, these wise men. We're about to read of this phenomenon, this astrological phenomenon, star in the sky. There's a political power play. We see treasure, we see worship. There are three references from the Old Testament which Matthew throws in there to show how Jesus is the promised one. There is a plot that is basically infant genocide, where all of these kids, these male kids, 2 or under, would be killed, and they were. There are 4 references to God communicating with people through dreams. There is angel activity, and you'll see Jesus on the run as a refugee in a foreign land, all in one chapter. But the Bible's a boring book, right? That's what people who don't read it think. That's mental, all in one chapter. So let's have a look. Chapter 2 of Matthew. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So, there's quite a lot in there, and you'll see there's quite a lot mentioning the way Herod reacts to the news of this star, which was to signify Jesus' birth. And then we see how the wise men react to the very same thing. In verse 2, we see that these wise men are searching, and their motive is to come and worship. Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star, and we have come to worship him. So their motive is to worship. But the very same situation for Herod is completely different, his response. In verse 3, we're told that he was disturbed. So he's not happy about this. This is a threat. See, the prophecy has got the wise men saying, "Where's the King of the Jews?" And as far as Herod's concerned, hold on a minute, I am the King of the Jews. That's me. I'm the only ruler here. I'm not happy about this other person coming on the scene. So he's disturbed. He's annoyed. You move on down to verse 7. You see that he's a bit cunning. He has this plan. He secretly speaks to the Magi. And it's all because he's basically getting a bit of research done so that he can figure out who he's looking for and how he can deal with them to solve this problem. And he lies in verse 8. He says he wants to worship in verse 8, but we realise that's the lie when the angel appears to Joseph and says, listen, you better get out of here because Herod is going to want to kill the child. So in verse 8, Herod's lying. So he's angry, he's annoyed, he sees the coming of Jesus as a threat. The wise men are so different. In verse 8, they're overjoyed. In my version, in verse 10, it says, in verse 10, they're overjoyed. They saw this star, the one they'd been following, the one that was going to lead them to the Christ child, God with us, and their reaction was that they were overjoyed. We read on, they come and see Jesus. Verse 11, they find him with Mary in the house, and what do? They bow down and worship him, and then they present him with their gifts. After that, they themselves are warned by God that, listen, Herod's dodgy. He has this plot, he wants to take Jesus out because he's just so power hungry, he doesn't want to share his throne. He sees this new king as a threat, and so God warns them and he tells them not to go back to Herod, and they obey God's instructions. When we come to the end of the chapter, maybe you can imagine Herod just tearing his hair out. He's furious in verse 16. So two very, very different reactions. One group who were motivated by joy and worship. The coming of Jesus for them was a good thing. The one who is coming is fulfilling the prophecy. He's going to be the King of Kings. This is a good day. And then your other fella, Herod, who this was not a cause for celebration for him because his eyes were only on himself and his throne, his power, his place in society. And so if he had to share that or give that up, I'm not interested. That's a bad day for him. So he's so angry, he's enraged, and he's not happy at all about this. So what has this got to do with you and me in Lurgan tonight? All these events that happened so long ago. What do we take from it? Well, the coming of Jesus, the fact that Jesus is who he says he is, the fact that he came and did what he did, will get different responses from people. Some people will see that as a good thing, a thing to celebrate, the one to be worshipped. Whereas others will reject that and say, no, not interested, not part of my plans, not part of my design for my life, a bit like King Herod. And so I guess the question for us to face tonight is, which group do we fall in, very broadly? Am I pleased about Jesus being who he says he is and doing what he did? Do I love that? Do I worship him for that? Or do I see him as a kind of a hindrance to my plans, the things that I want to do? Which group do you and I fall into? And I guess if we're honest, it's probably a bit of both. If I'm honest, there'll be times when it's a bit of both. Because I love Jesus. He saved me. He's given me life. He has the best plan for me. But at times, I have my own little ideas and my own little plans. And sometimes I feel like I just want to do what I want to do. And obviously that's part of living in a fallen world with a battle for the sinful heart. And thankfully we can be forgiven for that sin. But to be honest, there are times when I would be more like Herod and more like the wise men. Maybe if you're honest too, there's probably a little bit of that in your heart too. But thankfully he forgives us and he leads us through those times. So which camp would you be in tonight? Would you be more like those wise men, or would you be more like Herod? I guess the big question is, who do you worship? The wise men were on their journey because they believed this prophecy and they were out to worship the one that it pointed to. But Herod worshipped power and status and his image, who he was. So who do we worship? That's a big question. Who do I put first in my life, in the choices I make, in the things I do with my time, in the way I spend my money? Who do I worship? That's a big question. For Herod, he just couldn't let go of his ideas, his throne, his power. I like to think of him as a guy who just had his grip on all of those things so tight that I just couldn't let go and surrender to the one who was the King of Kings. He couldn't let go. Maybe there are things in your life where you're holding on to something and you can't have that Jesus. You can have everything else in my life, but this one thing, you don't get that. You can't have that. Maybe you can associate with that experience. See, Herod had his plan and he wasn't willing to surrender, and he thought his plan was best. But in a few kind of weeks' time, as we move through Matthew's Gospel, you'll come across this strange little verse in Matthew 10. Funny little verse, and when you read it, you think, what the heck is this all about? Matthew 10, verse 39. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. That's kind of like something you would imagine Yoda saying from Star Wars. Whoever finds their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. So what does that mean? If we lose our grip on our lives, that kind of mine attitude, if we lose that grip and say, okay, my life is no longer ruled by myself, but God, you are in control. You can rule me. You can command me. You can have my life. If we do that, if we lose our life in giving it to God, Jesus says, actually, when you do that, you find what real life is all about. Whereas if we feel like, oh, I've found the best thing for my life, my plan, if we think, yep, my ideas, actually, that's how you lose. If you just keep a grip on your own plans and you just forget God's and say, do you know what, my idea is better, you might think you know what you're doing, you might think you've got life nice and neat there, but according to Jesus, that's how you lose out. So there's a little bit of that happening with Herod, isn't there? He thought his throne, his power, his ideas, his lifestyle, his life ideas was the best thing going. But he lost out. He rejected God with us, and he lost out. Whereas the wise men, they gave up their lives. They left home. They went on a big, long journey, which would have cost time, money, effort. They gave up whatever they were doing at home because they realized the one that the prophecy spoke of was God with us. They gave up their lives, and in return, they actually found out what life was all about because they got to meet with God in the flesh, even though as a tiny infant, and they bowed down and worshipped him. We're almost in time for our discussion groups, but I want to give you an example of what it looks like to find life when you lose it, because it's a kind of a strange thing for us to get our heads around. The guy on the screen here is a fellow called James Back, and he's from southern Sudan, and I stayed with him for a few days down there. It's a war-torn country, really, really harsh living conditions. The mud huts behind are not there as a display of what people used to live like. They are where people live. This place has been described as the most hungry place on earth. There is no choice in food. We go to our supermarkets, shelves after shelf after shelf, none of that. If you managed to grow crops, you ate. If you didn't, you didn't. So it's the hungriest place on earth, and it's also a place of a huge conflict between north and south. A big war between the north of Sudan and the south of Sudan. Millions of people have been booted out of home. Thousands and thousands have been killed in this war. And James was a young lad when this war kicked off. And he's what are called the lost boys of Sudan, because everything was lost. Your home was just ravaged by the war. Basically, tribes would come in on horseback. Some of them had guns. There was bloodshed everywhere. People had to just run for their lives. And so when he was a kid, he was 10, one of these armies came bombing through the village on horseback, automatic weapons, just mowing anybody down that moved. Boom, 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 boom. Loads of people dying. So all the kids, James was maybe 13, I think he said at the time, lots of kids around that age, just ran into the African bush for cover and for safety. And the only thing they could do was leave their home of Sudan and walk to a refugee camp in neighbouring Kenya. This was a 3-month journey on foot with no food, no water. I said to him, how on earth did you survive? He said, I have no idea, James. No idea. In the day, the army from the north would fly overhead and drop bombs on us. And he said, I'd be walking along and suddenly you'd hear the plane and eventually it'd come over your head and there would drop bombs. And he said, my friends died next to me. These bombs fell, big explosion, bodies landed on it. One time, huge bomb went off, people landed on him and he lay there for hours until the bombing stopped, only to realise there was only 3 of them left. The person lying on him was dead, the person lying on him was dead, the person lying... just death everywhere. And he said, as if that wasn't bad enough, we decided to walk at night. You know, we'd hide during the day so that when the planes flew over the top we'd be safe. They would walk at night. And he said, we got taken out by animals. We got taken out by lions at night. This is in the heart of the African bush. Walking at night, pride of lions. He said, I saw my friends dragged off. Could you imagine that? In the end, they had to walk in a kind of like a chain, linked arms, holding hands, to try and appear to be bigger than what they actually were in order to ward off the lions. After 3 months, he finally set foot into a safe place in a refugee camp in Kenya. What a terrible, terrible ordeal for this guy. 13. Doesn't know if mum and dad are alive. Doesn't know if brothers and sisters are alive. Now finds himself in a foreign country in a refugee camp. Became a Christian in the refugee camp. Lived off rice that the UN provided. Lived there for many years. Moving into his kind of late teens, an offer from the US government came to the lost boys of Sudan in that camp. And this was the offer. Here are your papers, James and Timothy and John and whoever else was there. You sign these papers and you get a free pass to life in the United States. We're going to open our doors, our borders up to these boys from Sudan who've lost everything. We're going to take them in. You can have a new life in the US. Can you imagine that offer? Talking about the wealthiest country in the world, the US, where they talk about the American dream. Anybody could make it. You just go, you work hard. All these opportunities, all this access, all this privilege for a guy that's just had to walk for his life through the bush with nothing. That's a massive offer. Do you agree? But here's the thing. James had been feeling for weeks and weeks that God was speaking to him and calling him to return to his village and to share the news of Jesus that he himself had received. He felt God was saying to him, James, I want you to go back to your village of Lietnom and plant a church because the people in the village need to know about me. He's in a spot here. You've got the US in one hand. Freedom, wealth, privilege. Or you've got an invitation to go back to your war-torn village. You don't even know if your mum and dad are alive. You don't even know if you'll make it back. How long will you survive? James decided to go with the plan to go back to his village. With all of his flesh, with all of his heart, with all of his dreams, he would have chosen the US. Of course he would. That seems the obvious choice. Safety, a job, riches. That's a great plan. But he said, you know what? God was asking me. God was calling me. You can't turn God down. And so he gave up his life, his plan for wealth and riches in the US. He gave that up. He surrendered that. He lost that to follow God's plan. And when he went back, he discovered that his mum and his dad were alive. He discovered that his 2 brothers and 1 sister was alive. And he planted a church. And we went to visit that church. You can see here there's a mud brick wall being built. First ever church in that village. People are hearing about Jesus in that village for the first time ever. He has a wife, he has 2 kids. He says, James, I feel like the wealthiest man in the world because of what I've experienced. but I would not have experienced it if I hadn't have surrendered my plans and chose to follow God's. King Herod had his plans, his ideas, and he was no way going to let go of them. You've probably got your plans and your ideas. And God says, do you know what? I'll even interweave and build in all of the things that you like. God says, I'll give you the desires of your heart if you just let me be Lord. If you let me be the one who leads you. So that's the challenge for you and me tonight as we move into a little bit of kind of discussion time. 2 responses to the coming of Jesus. One which followed, obeyed and worshipped. One which said, no thanks, you're a hindrance, you're not a blessing, you're an obstacle and I want to get rid of you.